Welcome everyone. I am Rebecca Gale. I'm a reporter with the Better Life Lab at New America, where I cover childcare. And I'm also the moderator for today's webinar, The Changing Nature of the Childcare Beat from Leading Independent Journalists Who Cover It. This is co-hosted by the Better Life Lab and Early Learning Nation magazine. So you don't have to work in journalism to know that the field is changing rapidly right in front of our eyes. Newspapers are continuing to vanish at an average rate of more than 2 a week. And since 2005, this country has lost almost 3,000 newspapers, including more than 130 confirmed closings or mergers just in this past year. I'm taking this data from the State of the Local News report from Northwestern University, and the report projects that if we continue on this current trajectory, by the end of next year, the country will have lost 1/3 of the newspapers it has had since 2005. Discouragingly, this growth in alternative local news sources, such as digital or ethnic news outlets or public broadcasting, has not kept pace with what's being lost. So there is a lot we stand to lose with less local journalism. Fewer local journalists, fewer watchdogs, fewer hard-hitting stories that hold governments, businesses, and people accountable for their actions. And also fewer beat reporters. Beat reporters are people like those of us on this call today who cover one issue and learn the ins and the outs of it. For some of us, childcare is part of or all of our beat. In 2022, my Better Life Lab colleague and I, Haley Swenson, wrote an op-ed for the Columbia Journalism Review entitled, "Every News Outlet Needs a Childcare Beat." Our argument was that the COVID-19 pandemic had radically changed reporting, and many reporters and news outlets were unprepared for how to cover this issue. Many could not figure out some of the big questions in childcare, such as why is it so expensive? And why, unlike the rest of K-12 education, does the government do so little to fund it? Turns out these are not such easy questions to answer, but they are ones that these panelists have been wrestling with in their writing for years. And the four speakers joining us today have a few things in common. First, we write about childcare. Jackie, Mark, and Chabeli do this as part of their specific beats for their own publications, while I do this for a variety of publications. Leslie's columns in the Baltimore Banner span a variety of lifestyle topics, but she comes into childcare reporting as a single mother who knows how important it is to support families raising kids. Second, we are all parents. We write about childcare because it's a major economic issue, but also because we know that as parents, it's one of the most important and consequential decisions you can make. And for many of us, childcare has allowed our kids to thrive and for us to earn a living. Third, we care deeply about childcare as a policy and an industry. Our stories are not just about why childcare is good for kids, but how and why we need to pay providers more. We've all written about ways to make this a care economy work better for families it provides for and the families that work there. And so today's conversation would not be possible without the generous support of Early Learning Nation, which has become one of the premier go-to independent magazines for childcare coverage. A thank you to the managing editor, Linda Shockley, for all that she does and continues to do. As anyone who reads Early Learning Nation can attest, there's a balance of early learning policy, early learning research, nonprofit successes and challenges, and general feature stories written by a diverse group of voices. Indeed, some of the top people in the industry write for this publication. There are both fast turnaround breaking news pieces and long-form investigative pieces, such as the recent deep dive work from Elliot Haskell on private equity and childcare. And I highly recommend taking a look at that if you haven't already. And, pardon, I thank you to the Bezos Family Foundation, which founded and nurtured the evolution of this magazine. So in our conversation today, you'll hear from these reporters as to who they are, how they got started on their beats, how it has evolved, and where they think childcare reporting is going. We encourage you to submit any questions or comments into the Slido field whenever possible, which we all should have access to. And if you don't, please ping us, let us know. And whenever possible, if a reporter mentions a story, I will share a link, and if not, we will do it in a follow-up email after the event, and a recording will also be available. So thank you all, and let's begin. I want to actually start with that individual questions. I'm going to sort of do a pass around to the reporters to introduce themselves, explain sort of who they are, how they got the childcare reporting, and what their current beat entails. So Leslie, I'll start with you.
Oh, there I go. My name is Leslie Grace Jeter. I am a 30-year veteran journalist. I have been at the Baltimore Banner since its inception in 2022, and I am a lifestyle columnist, which means I write about everything. But I often write about parenting from both a personal and reported uh, experience. And I've done that gradually with other publications I've worked in, but this is the first time I've gotten to choose absolutely everything I do. And it comes back to who can take care of your kids, whether it's you or someone else. So that's how I got into it. It's much more experiential, but I think it resonates with a lot of people because that's the basis of being a parent.
Okay. Jackie?
Hi, everyone. So I'm a senior early childhood reporter at the Hechinger Report. I've been there for about 12 years. And I went into education reporting after a career change. I used to be a special education teacher. And when I started reporting for Hechinger, I was based in Mississippi. Kind of my first foray into childcare reporting was in Mississippi. My colleague and I did a 22-part series about childcare. We were just really shocked by the lack of oversight and the lack of support. And around that time when we published, I think it was around 2015, I happened to be pregnant with my oldest child, and my beat changed officially to just early childhood education, which encompasses for me prenatal health through third grade. And of course, childcare is a big part of that. And Heckinger's always been really supportive of early childhood. It's always been a beat for us. But I would say, personally, childcare has taken on an outsized role within my reporting. As Leslie was saying, it's just when that is your personal experience and you also know how important it is in terms of reporting on, it's easy for it to really take on the role it should.
Right. Shabali?
Everyone, I'm Chabeli. I'm the economy and childcare reporter at the 19th, which is official as of this week. I started with the 19th when we launched 4 years ago as the economy reporter. And before that had been a business reporter my whole career in Florida. And a lot of my focus had been on low-wage workers because that's what I was interested in. That was my approach to the economy beat. And that's also sort of my personal background. I'm an immigrant. My family grew up pretty low income, and my grandmother was a childcare worker. So when I got to the 19th, looking at the economy beat from a gender perspective, really that meant focusing again on low-wage workers, and childcare very quickly became a really significant part of that. The very, very first story we wrote at the 19th, once our website was live, was about the women's recession, how women were affected by the pandemic, and why childcare was such a huge element in that impact. And so it really just became a really cornerstone topic area for us. We've written about it a lot. It's resonated so much with our readers. And so ultimately this year we decided to officially add it to my title because it just made sense.
All right, Mark.
Uh, Hi, I'm Mark Swartz, and I write for Early Learning Nation, which is a project of the Bezos Family Foundation. And before writing for Early Learning Nation, I never called myself a journalist. I've always been a writer. I've written for nonprofits, either fundraising or communications, and that includes 4 years in New York City at the Robin Hood Foundation, which fights poverty in New York City, and a lot of the stories for the in-house publication and website that I was writing at the time had to do with childcare issues, along with homelessness and food insecurity, other poverty issues. And Linda Shockley at the Bezos Family Foundation, she had been my colleague at Robin Hood, and she invited me to start writing features when Early Learning Nation was getting off the ground. And so now I do that along with other kinds of writing, including fiction and children's books and shopping lists, things like that.
Great, thank you. So the panelists and I had a chance to have a call before this conversation. And one thing we all really came to was the idea that the COVID-19 pandemic changed childcare, both in terms of the way the news media covered it, the way we covered it, and stories that had already been written were getting more attention. So I'd like to actually, I know that Jackie's had started working on the story long before the pandemic started, and then it became incredibly relevant. And Chabeli told me that that was right when the 19th was actually launching on its own. So I'd like to talk with you all a bit about how the pandemic changed childcare reporting for you and what as a journalist you saw. So Jackie, do you want to start it?
Sure. Yeah, the story that you're talking about, I think. So I started reporting. I was following a childcare owner. I live in Austin, Texas, and she was in North Austin. And I'd been working on this story for so long, profiling her for maybe a year. Her name's Shamanika, this fantastic childcare provider. And then the pandemic hit. And so the story kind of, it had been this profile of this is what it's like to be a childcare owner. And then, it hit and the story completely changed. At the same time, for me, I had been reporting on childcare for several years, but this was the first time when the pandemic hit, I was getting scooped suddenly. I was like, like childcare, I love the beat, but like there was not a lot of competition. I wasn't used to getting scooped. And I was finishing a story. I think it was maybe the second week of the pandemic. I had my kids at home. It was a miserable time for all of us parents. And I was talking to a source and she was like, I think the Washington Post just published the story that you're working on. And I was like, that never would have happened before, right? But I think we've seen there's this huge change, right, in the amount of childcare reporting happening, which is fantastic. Even though it's been hard personally, I think for those of us who are covering it, now we're really having to push ourselves, which is good. It's hard, but good. Because there's just a lot more reporting and it's pushing us all, I think, to go deeper. And we're not I think we're more nuanced too. We're not having to kind of explain, these are the issues with childcare in the industry. I think that's known more. And I think that became a lot more known to the public during the pandemic. And so I think it really frees us up to go deeper, to kind of expand our coverage into different types of childcare, right? Like friend, family, neighbor care, informal caregivers, just really expanding beyond, I think, what we could do in the past. And then lastly, sorry, I'm taking a lot of time, but I think there's a lot more information now for us, a lot more data. There's a lot more people looking into it on the expert side and on the data and research side, which helps us reporters kind of get more out there. So I think overall it's changed our reporting. It's harder, but it's for the best. It's both harder and easier in terms of having more resources and more people to talk to about it. But yeah, the competition aspect, that was something I did not expect when the pandemic hit.
Oh, well, Chabeli, you also said that you guys have been working on some stories for a while, and then when the pandemic hit, the interest really shot up. So tell me a bit about how the pandemic's rise and interest on these issues also coincided with the 19th really coming into its own.
Yeah, so like I mentioned, that first story, childcare was such a huge thread of that story. And at the time, I wasn't a parent yet. I was just learning, going through all the same questions people often now ask me, like, why is it so expensive and why is it so hard to find? And I was just like really struck by it over and over again. And as we were writing about it from the prism of gender, it really kind of helped to me, it felt even more urgent because I was talking to women who were leaving the workforce because they felt forced to, because they lost access to childcare and were really questioning their sense of self, who they were, their futures, their families. And it just became, I think, so visceral for so many people in their lives, and not just for women, right? For all people, because suddenly it was very visible, like just how important that access to childcare was, and how much it could derail all these different things in people's lives if they didn't have access to the care that they needed. So that started to grow over time. And to the point Jackie was making too, started to be more data, and we started to kind of find these little inroads where now suddenly childcare policy, because we cover policy really heavily, and politics, it was a much bigger part of the conversation, right? It was starting to show up in different pieces of policy. We wrote a story last year about how the Farm Bill has a childcare provision in it for the very first time. I wrote that with our climate reporter, right? Like what a combination, right? But childcare was now Jessica, who's our fantastic climate reporter, she's so good, has written about childcare a lot because of the connections with heat. So it started to really permeate into all of these different areas where now we see it all the time, right? It became so obvious, and COVID sort of helped that along a little bit, I think. And now, to us, it feels such an essential piece of talking about the workforce, the future, early education, children, all of these things that also have sort of a gender and racial undertone as well, which is what we focus on too.
And this is one of the questions from the audience as well, as to why childcare had previously been relegated to basically this very niche idea of parenting. And from what I'm hearing both of you say, and that in our larger panelist discussions, is that this is really an issue that affects so many different aspects of regular coverage. That's why you need it. And Leslie, I see you nodding along. And I wanted to ask you, you have an excellent story about the importance of 24-hour daycare. And I know you really bring in your own personal experience about because you're a lifestyle reporter and you're also a single mother, and I wanted to give you a chance to sort of talk about how that's really colored your version of how to report on this topic.
Thank you. When we had our pre-discussion, Chabeli had talked about how I think it was Chabeli, how so much of this is wrapped in mom guilt. That even though every parent, no matter what your family looks like, if there's, 2 men, 2 women, man and woman, whatever, that it affects everyone. But the primary onus is on the mother to be the person that fills in those gaps. And it's suggested sometimes that her job, whatever that job is outside the home, is less important than that. So I wrote about how I was that mother who was pulling up to daycare at 5:56, 5:57, literally willing the light to change before they start charging you at 6. Because it wasn't just about the money. It was about the shame of something else being more important than your kid. But then again, they close at 6, right? You said 6, not 5:57. So I'd written about, so I find things on formerly Twitter, now X often. There had been a woman in Houston who had posted a video of herself, single mother, young African-American woman, looked to be in her 20s, early 30s, and she was excited to go to a girls' night. And they have 24-hour daycares in Houston. Some of these facilities are always, some of them have just special parents' nights out, that kind of thing. So she was dropping a little girl off. Her little girl was so happy. She was skipping. She was so happy to be there and hang out with kids or whatever. So the mom, who was cute, she's got her makeup on, she got her hair did, she's going, yeah, and she's peace out. And she comes back, her kid's happy, everyone's go. And of course, the response, some moms are like, that's amazing. And other people, because they like being in your business, were like, well, how dare you? And I noted in my story that had she said, I'm a single mother who works 3 jobs and I have to have my child in 24-hour daycare so I can work the third of them overnight, they would have said, look at you, good for you, doing what you need to do. But God forbid she needs a break. She needs to be a person. And then it's a problem. And so I did, as you mentioned before, talk to people about the ins and outs of that. I talked to childcare providers who used to offer it and don't. One woman I spoke to said that, she provides regular daycare and she would provide 24-hour, but she runs it out of her home. So she'd have to clean up for the regular kids, have the other kids come. If they were there till midnight or something, she had to then turn around, take a quick nap and start in the morning for the ones to be dropped off at 6:30. And it just was not feasible, which says there need to be more, I think, government interventions to provide, as well. Some people don't want us to have public school either, but that's another story. To have, as we provide those resources for K through 12, to also provide those for daycare, and not just for Head Start, for actual daycare. And just so many, both moms. I spoke to a woman who's a friend of mine, who's a journalist in Virginia, who said that when she was a single mom with 2 kids, had she not, she was on assistance and it didn't cover those hours. She got a voucher, but the voucher didn't cover that. So she had to come out of her own pocket as a single mother to provide the care for her kids while she was working overnight, one of her 2 jobs, as a security guard at a local college. And it just makes you go, one of the reasons I write about these things is because, like I said, my specialty is life. So that's very broad, but that you don't think about these things until sometimes they affect you. And when you talked about COVID, that so many people had this light bulb, wait a minute, magical gnomes do not take care of our children and deliver our food. And it became, and they don't. And so it became something that we retroactively, I think, not just because we needed to care for our kids, but I think that we really started to think in a humane way about the people and the infrastructure that's involved in making sure that we as middle to upper middle class families and working class families are able to take care of our kids.
I agree strongly with that. And I think I want to actually segue from what you said to reporting on some of these people. You said magical gnomes. I think that's a really strong image there of how people, we relegated a lot of these jobs to the shadows, even though many of us are very close to our childcare providers and know them very deeply. It's not always a job that's depicted either in media or popular culture. And so I want to push this over to Mark for a minute, who's done a lot of work in his own stories, uplifting a lot of these individual voices. Including centering his stories on the people who are actually providing care and giving them really a platform to tell it. Can you talk a bit about both that process and how that goes in part with the type of journalism you're doing?
Sure. And going back to the pandemic question, the first stories that Early Learning Nation ran when the pandemic hit were about Zoom story hour, and the zoo had a live cam where you could look at animals, and there are art activities you can do on Zoom, but there's only so much of that. And the bigger story, I think, became the racial reckoning that was in every aspect of the country. But for me, the lens on childcare, brought that home. When my kids were young, first we had nannies, and then we had childcare in the neighborhood, and we could afford to pay for that. But lots of families don't have that, and so it was very eye-opening to visit childcare centers. The one that I visited in Rockville, Miss Tiffany in Precious Moments. This is one of the only stories that I got to sit on the floor with the children, and I definitely want to do more of that. They were great, and Miss Tiffany was just superb at controlling the class and teaching, and she had eyes in the back of her head when a kid was going to swallow a Lego, and she was a professional in every sense of the word, and it was just dazzling to watch her in action. And she's a solo entrepreneur, probably making, barely getting by, probably, considering all the work and hours that she puts in. So that was very eye-opening. And I wrote a similar story about a caregiver in the Bronx through an organization called All Our Kin. And she was talking about how she might not be able to stay in the field that she loves because she wasn't able to make ends meet without the government subsidies that came along during the pandemic, but then ended.
I feel like so many of us have had stories, I know I have, where you interview a childcare provider who loves their work, but is very much aware they can go down the street to Target and make much more money on a much more predictable schedule. And that's not really the way our country should be framing the investment in younger kids. And we know that high quality childcare can deliver really great results. So this is a question from the audience that I want to put out there to our team, which is, how can we change this narrative from childcare being a personal expense where everybody finds their own care, to one that is a public good and publicly funded, like we do with K through 12 education? What sort of things have you guys found either move the needle or get a reaction from your readers? And I'm happy, and feel free to jump in if you're
I
ready
can
to start.
jump in. Yeah,
Okay.
this is something I'm really passionate about because I feel like a lot of coverage in America is geared at the argument that we know most Americans, it might resonate with them, which is the economic argument, right? And I know why like that resonates, but I really wish more Americans cared about the impact on children. Like this is a bigger conversation, right? These children are sitting in childcare programs that don't have resources, or with stressed out caregivers, or don't have access to childcare, and they're with stressed out parents, which we know from, rapid EC data trickles down to impact children's brains. So something we've tried to do at Hechinger, and luckily we've had access to quite a few trainings or programs with the Dart Institute for Journalism and Trauma at Columbia. And that's really helped us infuse a lot more like brain science research into our work. And really focus on, okay, so when there's a revolving door of child care workers, what does that do to a child's brain, right? If they are, I've seen that with my own kids when they have a new, a teacher every few weeks, or suddenly their assistant teacher's gone and someone new is in there and then they're gone. And it's like we see this as parents, and I think we need to be thinking more as a country about, okay, so how is all of this impacting children and their brains? Because these kids are then growing up into our next grown-ups, right? And don't we want our next generation to have well-developed, like joyous, childhoods and brains, and just, I don't know, have all the opportunities that they should. And I don't think that's as much of a focus as it should be.
I agree with that. I think that's kind of where we should be going with some of this. I can make the economic argument, till the day I die. It's literally my job, but I think there's other pieces of this that we need to consider. And I thought about this a lot when I was on parental leave, actually, in 2022, 21, 22. Oh my goodness. And see, the mom brain already comes in. And I was thinking, what are the worst possible outcomes of a system that we do not invest in? And ultimately, to me, that was children getting hurt or children dying. And so that resulted in a project I worked on for like 6 or 8 months. That was about what has happened when we haven't invested in childcare. And 10 years ago, the Child Care and Development Block Grant had the first requirements for safety in childcare, the first standardized national requirements. And we were 10 years out now from that. And I wanted to see what had happened. I mean, had we been able to implement all these safety requirements? Had we invested in doing that? And the answer was we hadn't in a lot of places. A lot of states were still really far behind in reporting, even consistently, the number of deaths and serious injuries and abuse cases in childcare, in reporting inspection reports, in doing background checks to the standard that we, had set out as a country. This was our standard. So for me, that was another, I think, important element of helping people understand this is what happens when we don't invest in a system, and the outcomes can be really dire. The main sort of source in that story was a mom whose child died at daycare on his second day, and he was 4 years old. And at the time, she had tried to pass a law in Hawaii. She lived in Hawaii, to get daycares to get the state to publicly post this information of how many kids were getting hurt. And she was told, you don't need to do that. We just passed a federal law that's going to do that. We called her 10 years after that in 2024, and Hawaii still wasn't reporting that data, still wasn't doing it. And to hear that, the disappointment in that mom of realizing we haven't done the things we said we were going to do in prioritizing this, and here's what happened. And I know that, and she knew that very personally. So I think we need to talk about safety. I think we need to talk about development, about all of these other things that childcare brings to these children's lives, to these families' lives, why it's important beyond just it's an economic issue, which is a really salient argument as well, but there's more to it.
You mentioned that story, and that was some of the watchdog reporting you had talked about. Tell us briefly about what happened since that story's come out.
Yeah, so so that story was a fascinating sort of reporting experience because it was so nitty gritty that by the end of it, I was like explaining to these states what their requirements were because they didn't even know. So we had 6 states that updated their data by the time the story ran. And after the story ran, I think there was I don't want to mess up the number. I think it was like another 5 states that updated their data. And so now that data is available, it's online, it's hopefully easier to find. It's still really difficult to find, but as a part of that story, we did do this like dashboard that broke down where to find it for your state, what are the most recent numbers, where to find inspections, just so parents had a sort of an easier access to that information and it could feel actionable for them too, not just doom and gloom, because it was a really sad story, but we wanted them to take that information and help it inform their choices.
Absolutely. And so now more states have been able to be responsive because they see a news outlet like your own is really holding them accountable. I know this is part of what we all really want out of quality reporting. Leslie, I did not mean to cut you off, so I want to toss it back to you, particularly on the last question.
Sorry, I jumped the gun because I was
No, of
excited
course.
at this point. I think that, and this is the weird thing to say, as you mentioned, newspapers and print publications. I work for a digital publication. That these entities disappear so fast. But I think that as we try to grow or stabilize the industry, we have to have more reporting and more newsrooms led by people who understand that these things are important, and not just in specialty publications, not just on Mother's Day or Father's Day or when the school starts or whatever, but we have to have people. And I don't think it has to be there. I don't think you necessarily have to have parents and women who are the decision makers in a newsroom, but it helps because those are the people who, when you have someone whose life is directly affected by that, you come to a budget meeting and say, hey, why don't we write about this? Where maybe 50 years ago or whatever, in the Mad Men era, the dudes were hoping the wives were taking care of it and drinking at their desk from a flask, reporters, and not, that wasn't on their foreground. That was for the ladies section. That was for the Sunday section. That was a special thing we did. Are you happy we wrote about it? Yes. It's going to take a normalization. Part of what I have tried to do as an African-American person, as a woman who's very proud to be, there are not a lot of columnists of record at mainstream publications who are both Black and female, or either or. And so to have a voice, I don't speak for Black people or for women, but I speak with a voice that informs that. And I think that if there were more mothers and informed parents and people to be in those positions who said, I'm not just whining about myself, I'm talking about a real thing that affects people, more people would go past the magical gnomes part and go, oh, this is real. This isn't just something that affects someone else. I don't have to wait until a freaking pandemic to know that this affects people.
Exactly. Mark, has that been your experience as well? Have you found some of these arguments resonate with your audience or editors differently?
Yeah, the Early Learning Nation conducted a survey of our readers about 2 or 3 months ago, and a lot of the people who read it are child care providers, but there was a lot of people from the advocacy community, either from foundations or nonprofits, and the brain science comes up, the policy comes up, local programs come up. So if something is happening in Minnesota, I wrote about some faith-based activists in Minnesota. They're advocates and providers through an organization called Isaiah. Hopefully, readers, advocates in the other states can see what they're doing and learn from that. So not only are foundations supporting and philanthropists supporting the work we're doing as writers, they're also often supporting the work we're covering. And many of them talk about scaling up solutions. So we highlight solutions that the foundations are supporting in the hope that the government will support them and scale them up nationwide.
That's really interesting what you're saying about the philanthropists supporting both ends of the writing process and some of the stories that were covered, especially the solutions-oriented stories. And for anybody on the call who's not familiar with solutions journalism, it's the idea that you uplift a story where it shows a solution that is working, ideally one that can be scaled. Because then if readers just read a story that's just about problems with no solution, they can sort of take away a defeatist attitude, versus if there is a problem presented with a solution, they more engaged with the story and more engaged to take action. That's the thesis, and something that we write a lot about at the Better Life Lab. Something we talked about is that there's a lot of philanthropic investment coming to local journalism, which is great. And in that same report that I referenced at the beginning of this call, there's $500 million is coming to support local news. So I'm curious for each of you, how do you see such philanthropic funding playing a role in the existing news that you do cover? Mark, you mentioned it briefly, but I'd love to hear from all of you as well.
Yeah, let me just add to that because I felt like I wanted to fit it in. So Early Learning Nation is sponsored by the Bezos Family Foundation, but we have a pretty strong firewall. So the writers for Early Learning Nation aren't just writing about Bezos supported projects. And if a story that an organization that Bezos Family Foundation is funding comes up, it sort of goes through the same editorial review as any other story. So there's a divide between church and state, and I think that has to be the case when you want to report something objectively.
I can talk about this a little bit because we just got a pretty large grant from the Melinda Gates Foundation, which we're really, really excited about. It's amazing. And I'm going to talk about this sort of with the realist hat and also with like the hopeful hat, right? So my realist hat is like, for us, this funding means sustainability. It means that we'll be able to be around for, you know, however much longer, hopefully forever. And that's really what we're investing it in. We're trying to be really smart about how we use it. That might mean that there might be some new beats, but it's not going to be this enormous explosive growth because we want to be around. We want to be sustainable. And we've seen so many other newsrooms that have imploded because they've grown too fast. And that's you know, to make the childcare analogy, that is happening in a lot of newsrooms, is that, you know, funding that they're receiving is to stay open, to stay functioning, to stay available, to stay providing the basis of news that they are currently providing. And we saw that certainly during the pandemic with childcare, you know, providers that were able to stay open with stabilization funds. And that's very similar in news. Now, with my hopeful hat is that some of that funding will give us a little bit of flexibility, right? Like now in my beat, I have a little bit more time and space and room to really think hard about how do we push childcare further? What more can we write? How much can we do that gives us a little bit more room instead of being, you know, so sort of stuck to the day to day and like, let's churn stuff out. I can have a little bit of that breathing room. And similarly, my colleagues that are covering other topics like climate, like I gave you that example, can also do the same about being more expansive in the way that we think about our stories and how we cover childcare and the role that childcare plays. And I mean, the dream is that there's more childcare beats, right? There's more places that, you know, when you think about journalism years ago, you had the econ desk with a bunch of reporters covering different topics under economy, and the same with education. Now, a lot of the time, it's just the one or two, and it's harder. So if we could expand that so that people can become more specialized in these subjects, again, that is to the benefit of us and our readers. And it leads to better reporting, more nuanced reporting, and hopefully more childcare reporting.
Yeah, we're in a similar situation as the 19th, as Chibeli was just explaining, we're foundation funded, and we've received funding where we've been able to hire another reporter, but she splits her time with K-12 and early childhood. So not as much as we would like we would love to have several early childhood reporters. And to Chibeli's point, that would hopefully, you know, maybe let one focus on childcare and one focus on other aspects of early childhood, and kind of separate out into specialty areas. I've been really interested watching the philanthropic funding that's going to major news outlets to fund early childhood beats. Like I know the LA Times has an early ed reporter, the AP has an early ed reporter. I've seen this at a few other, even like smaller newspapers have early ed reporters. But when I talk to the editors there, or, you know, look into this funding, it's generally a 2-year grant, which makes me worried for, you know, what happens when that funding ends if these philanthropists decide, okay, well, we're not going to fund, you know, that position anymore. I really wonder and worry that that beat wouldn't, you know, be supported with funds that the newsroom or news outlet has, if that special area funding went away. So that's something I'm watching as some of these roles get, you know, further into their time periods to see if they'll continue. And I really hope they do. But I think philanthropy, you know, really is critical here to keep this going because, you know, as Chibeli said, a lot of news outlets, you know, they may only have one education reporter now, or, you know, if you're gonna, you know, spend the little money you have, maybe you need to put that on a politics reporter, right? So it's just tough decisions that are being made right now.
I will say that at the Baltimore Banner, we were fortunate enough to be started with funding by Stuart Bainham, who is a local philanthropist. So we started that, and then we started. We do have some philanthropy, and we do have subscriptions. Even though we are a nonprofit news firm, people get confused. They're like, "Well, why do you have subscriptions?" It's like because we're not free. Our reporters enjoy eating, but I like myself. But we started off with 2 education reporters. We have 3, and as you mentioned, I think that part of the ingenuity of having people who think about things differently, either that they came from, say, places like the Baltimore Sun and they did traditional education reporting and now have a chance to branch out and cover things like education and childcare and those things, both from policy standpoint, like you said, both from a practical standpoint, both from a what are we doing about this with schools and all of it. And I think that's good because there's also some I think of them as young people, like younger reporters in their 20s and 30s who are coming up and they're only learning this model of journalism. So there's a lot of stuff they haven't had to unlearn, which I think is really great too, because and the model that we have, we're starting from the ground up rather than being a traditional publication that is shrinking and trying to switch all our news or of our resources around. So it's been really neat to see. I think we need more. We need more of everything. We always need more of all reporters, all types of reporters. But I think that we have invested in education. I would like to see us have more of those dedicated conversations about that.
Mark?
Oh, I don't have anything to add. I like the Baltimore Banner is a great example of independent journalism that isn't topic focused, and I wish there were more of those. If anybody is listening who can support those.
It's a good call out. I want to take a question that also came from the audience about how this is an election year, as we all know, but it is crickets on these issues that affect so many people. What would it take to make something like childcare a hot political issue?
I mean, for the record, I think that it being crickets is also a story. We literally just wrote a story about that, about how Biden and Trump talked about golf more than they talked about childcare in the most recent debate. And we were so excited to see that there was a childcare question. But then probably disheartened like many people that they just felt like they could ignore it and talk about something else. So, it's difficult because the reality is in a lot of political spheres, this is still being relegated into a side topic, right? And we're still doing a lot of work to bring it to the center. The momentum around Build Back Better was really exciting to see because it was getting so much attention. But I think what people need to realize and politicians need to realize is actually this is one of those topics that touches people in their lives really directly. There's a lot of cynicism around politics. I hear this a lot from people. I talk to a lot of people of color. I talk to a lot of low-wage communities that don't feel like politics speaks to them, that is not addressing the real issues that they are experiencing in their lives, that are disillusioned to even vote this year because they don't feel like these politicians are going to do anything for them. That's something I hear all the time. And childcare is one of those topics where people feel like, if a politician could step into this and do something about this in some way, this would impact my life so directly, so enormously that, that making that connection, I think, is really important in terms of what it would take. We also did a story where we asked every single member of Congress. I don't recommend anybody to do this. This was an insane amount of work. What their stance on childcare was. And we got almost no Republicans back, a bunch of Democrats, sort of the expected responses. And I just think we need to keep pushing and pushing and pushing the conversation and getting them to say, where do you stand? Where do you stand? Like you would be able to tell me right away where you stand on many other topics, on healthcare, on education. Tell me where you stand on this.
Can I say, I hate this, and I come from a pop culture and, you know, background and having covered scandals and things like that in the 2000s, which are terrible. But I sometimes think it would have to take a crazy scandal, like someone having, I don't know if you remember during the Clinton administration that they had 2 different people who got struck down because they had hired undocumented nannies. And
Yes.
then there was a conversation about in the media after the, oh my God, of what is it, how do we, you know, regulate health nannies and all that kind of stuff. So these conversations grew out of a crazy scandal. So I think that there would have to be, not that I say there should be, but I think that there would have to be, in the middle of can we save democracy, there would have to be somebody not paying their nanny or somebody's nanny having crazy pictures of them or something. And then we might get a side conversation with intrepid journalists like yourself to jump in at the right moment and go, but what about the child care? So I don't know.
Like maybe there's an unlicensed program in Congress, Leslie, that we could go investigate.
Right.
Yeah, I think so this made me think immediately. I'd done some reporting in Canada and Norway on their childcare systems, and it seems in both countries, something that really moved the needle on this was having, like what Leslie was saying earlier about maybe being a parent or a mother in a newsroom helps get more coverage. Both countries can point to mother leaders who had like high-powered political roles finally moving the needle and making progress in childcare policy. So I think that's one thing, but I agree we need to keep asking politicians for their stance and elevating their comments on childcare. I've been working on an investigation into deregulation that's coming out this fall. And so I've been watching a lot of, or visiting kind of subcommittee meetings in various states, especially in the Midwest. And the comments that come up when they talk about childcare from especially older male lawmakers are, well, I was a lifeguard. And so like, I could watch kids as a teenager. So let's have teenagers watch kids.
Oh,
And,
God.
it's like lifeguard or babysitting, or one lawmaker said something about like, well, kids serve food. This was about a debate to let 14 and 16-year-olds work in childcare programs. And it was, kids serve food in restaurants, and it's just this complete lack of understanding, right? So I think elevating comments like that and bringing those into the public realm and pushing lawmakers, some think that some think they are doing things to impact childcare. There are like very quiet movements happening in states. It may not be what a lot of experts and advocates want to see, but I think that's why it's important to follow what states are doing on their own. And yeah, really ask lawmakers to, like Tribelli was saying, like take a stand and tell us what you think about childcare.
Yeah, states and cities have a lot of different policies. They're more than the people on this call could possibly cover. But hopefully, when we write about a policy, good or bad, in Alabama or Nebraska, other readers, advocates in the other states are learning from that, and that's the election is not just happening on a federal level; it's happening in states and cities too, and so we're hopefully playing a small role in highlighting solutions or highlighting alarming trends in child labor, for example. And I wish we could do more, people on this call and other colleagues, but there's only so many of us, and there are a lot of stories.
I would like to hear from each of you about a story that you've been a part of that you think has been really pivotal in your own coverage of childcare for any reason, but something that really stood out to you. You mentioned a bunch of great stories, and you're welcome to use a repeat, but something that in your course of reporting it or in the response you got that you thought this was potentially breaking through some barrier or obstacle in its way and either resonating with more people or helping to change the conversation.
I already talked about the one that I really love, which is the project. And my hope for that project, honestly, is that reporters in different states will look at what their state is doing in terms of childcare safety. But I'll mention another one that is kind of a smaller story, but I really love doing it. At the time that the stabilization grants were ending, there was a lot of stories about what impact that would have on childcare. And it made me kind of want to take the narrower view, and I tried to find a town where with very few childcare providers, where one of them was closing because the stabilization grants were ending. And the kind of ripple effect that has on an entire community. So we found this daycare called Giggles and Wiggles, incredible name, in Wisconsin, in this little town in Wisconsin. I think there was only 2 other providers in that town that was closing after many, many years in operation, 25 years, I think. And so we talked to the providers on their last week. We talked to the families that were being impacted. We talked to the teachers. One family had a child with autism and were having a really difficult time finding somewhere else that would take him. Giggles and Wiggles have been the only place that have been willing to take him and care for him. And then that parent was questioning whether she was going to stay in the workforce as a result of that. And that story was a really sort of narrow story on this little town, but we got so much feedback on it because sometimes when it's these big, big topics, it's hard to kind of get a good handle on what it really means. And going narrow sometimes helps. And I think for a lot of people reading about this little town and this one little daycare and all these families that were served by it, really helped them see at a really personal level what it means when just one place closes, how it impacts an entire community. And I really loved that story. And I think it taught me something about how ultimately at the end of the day, this is still a really personal topic for a lot of families.
Exactly. And on the micro level, the changes are enormous.
I can jump in. I wrote a story about the impact of the pandemic on children's brains and how a trauma-based approach in childcare can kind of help reverse that, and how important childcare providers are for helping children during the pandemic. And that was part of a fellowship I did with the Dart Center. And that story, I mean, sitting in a childcare program where providers have been trained on trauma-based instruction and know exactly how to work with children. I mean, it was just incredible to see this, but then also pretty infuriating to think that so many children don't have access to this kind of caregiving. And I think that is something that is kind of keeps me going with my childcare reporting, thinking about, you know, stories like that where there are such strong needs that young children have, and childcare providers want to meet all these needs, but they often don't have the resources or support or funding to do it. And that's just really infuriating. And so I think that was a story where, kind of really getting into brain development and explaining, right, like neural connections and all of these like nitty-gritty details of brain development and trying to make that understandable for the general public was something that I've then tried to do in stories after that. And then just quickly on a happier note, this story is not published yet, but I'm really excited for it to come out this fall. I recently went to Norway, and this has been the most refreshing experience of any childcare reporting I've done. In Norway, they call their childcare programs kindergartens, and they have a kindergarten law that says kindergarten must respect and enhance a child's childhood and respect a child's autonomy and just respect the child. And it was so refreshing to see this whole society that's kind of like, yeah, we want children to have a good childhood. Let's send them to these delightful kindergartens, right? Where they were like, playing with knives and there was fire. And for me as an American, it was a little scary, but they were all, I mean, it was magical. It was amazing. And I know there are, nuances there and challenges, and I'm getting into that in the story, but that's something else that I think is really making me kind of branch out now and think about, highlighting other countries and how that can maybe wake up some Americans who don't realize really how bad we have it.
a really amazing switch of the perspective that childcare needs to work for the child, to sort of have that centered approach. No economic argument here, no return on the investment, just this idea that this program is really set up to uplift the kids. And I think that's part of the reason why it seems so strange for us to hear. I think that story will be fantastic, and I really can't wait to read it. You said this fall?
Yes, it's coming out in, I think, either October or November in the Christian Science Monitor.
Awesome. Right, Mark, I know you've got a story teed up as well that you want to talk about.
Yeah, there's one story I want to mention. A professor and expert on the environment, Frederica Pereira at Columbia University, but it's sort of part of a trend that I didn't spot first. I credit Elliot Haspel and people at Capita and probably others that the overlap between global warming and early childhood, once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. And so interviewing experts like Dr. Pereira, and we're about to publish an interview I did with somebody from the Moms Clean Air Force, somebody in the state of Iowa. And this is an issue, we talk about in my household. It's something like kids care about. They're older, they're 16 and 20. But I think it's going to make the people who read our publications open their eyes more and perhaps bring people from other fields into our field a little bit and see the connections. Babies have, smaller brains that are developing rapidly. They're low to the ground where the air is not as clean. When they drink water that isn't clean, it can do more damage to their little organs. And so this is a powerful argument that I feel very privileged to spotlight in Early Learning Nation.
Lovely.
Yeah, very quickly, the one that I spoke about before about the 24-hour daycare, I love that the most because I got to speak not just to parents, but to providers, because providers and parents often have, well, they're coming at it from different places, even those who are parents, because it's a business for them and it's something they have to do. And they want to, Miss Janie and Miss Lori and Miss whoever they love your kids, but also they like to eat. And they also, I mean, if I can, be a little heavy for a second, when we think, all right, the magical elves and the people, they have their own kids. This goes back, I hate to say things like slavery, where it wasn't really important what happened to the providers' kids. It was about your kids because they were more important, and who cares what they do? It's like the help, so to talk to people in this modern context about how this affects everybody, and they know you need 24-hour care, right? But they can't always do it. They probably can't do it. There's series of places in Maryland that advertise that they do it. And right now only one center does it and no one has asked for it, they say. So I there has to be a culture of opening up and saying, what are our needs and what can we do together? The other one that I wrote that I was really proud of was about summer camp. It was one of those who knew this was a thing stories where, because I am a mom and my mother was I'm widowed. My mother was my co-parent until she got married 2 years ago and moved out and is living her own, hot 75-year-old life, and she's doing her thing. But suddenly it's like camp is super expensive. It's one of those, why did no one tell me that during the summer you have to shell the average is I don't pay that much, but the average in some places is like $1,000 a week just for day camp. The most expensive programs I was paying were like $450, and that wasn't all of them. And this summer, my kid, because he's older, he's 10, almost 11. He did 2 weeks of baseball camp. We're not traveling. He's downstairs. I could hear him doing his bass lesson while we were doing that and he went to the office with me yesterday because I happen to have an office that allows me to do that. But if you don't, you still have to work. You don't get a summer break from your job. And so, I mean, we were Gen Xers, so, and I was a twin. So our parents like, you'll be fine by yourself. We assume you're home and not, riding your bike like the Goonies, discovering pirate ships, whatever. We don't know. We're not there. Gen X. But I think I was proud of that story because it was a practical, I felt stupid for not realizing this. Like I just got caught up. It's like, here's an entire list. Cause you as parents, you get those emails about, hey, the local, whatever, here's a bunch of camps. and the good ones all fill up immediately. It's like one of my the parents I spoke to was like, it's a part-time job to in February or March to start researching because you got to step them up. It's like, getting Nikes or whatever, you got to be on that list or you don't get it. And I just, once again, approached it from a common sense thing that everyone who works, who has children will have this moment where they go, what? So I was very proud of that one.
I do think camps bring up such an interesting quandary for American childcare because parents are always scrambling to figure something out. And this happens every year to nearly every parent. And yet we have not actually come up with any sort of system to sort of really make some base or some safety net essentially for kids to go somewhere during the day or evening so parents can work. And it's, like I said, the stories always come out in the early summer and then they finish out by the end and the school year starts and it starts all over again. And I'm actually going to share a story that I wrote where this was one of the only stories I've written from a really personal perspective of what happens when summer camp doesn't actually work for your kid. And there are some kids for whom the summer camp setup is not ideal, whether it is personality, whether it is, a neurodivergence issue. And they can really struggle in these settings, and then there can really be no options for certain families. So I'll share that as well. But I want to also be mindful of time, and I wanted to hear from each of you too on where you see childcare reporting going. Like if we're having this conversation in 5 years or even 10 years, what could look different about it? I know we have hopes for it, so I'd like to hear those, but I also want to hear what you actually see the trajectory going, whether it's more watchdog stories, more philanthropic funding, more beats, whatever it is. Now is our chance to really prognosticate in here. So whoever's ready to begin, I'd love to hear where you see this 5 years from now when we're back in 2029. What are we saying happened? Who won the election? No, that answer that.
I've been really excited to see local outlets, national outlets, all kinds of outlets write about childcare in the past couple of years and in ways I've never seen them write about. And so I would love for that to be a steady cadence of that where writing about childcare is just something that we do. It might not be a full beat yet in some places, but it's part of our education coverage. It's part of our economy coverage. It's just something that hopefully has entered sort of our collective consciousness and is not leaving. So I'd love to see that. And I'd love to see more of childcare coverage being pushed forward outside of just talking about, not having childcare affects parents, affects providers, but going beyond to some of what, Jackie was saying too about children's development, about safety, a lot more watchdog. I would love a lot more watchdog journalism on childcare because it is also a system while in crisis that also needs to be monitored to ensure that people do the things that they say they're going to do. The money goes where it's supposed to go. These programs are actually improved. Children actually get access, right? Because we've seen that not happen, right? We have all this federal funding, but only a small slice of kids are actually able to access that funding. So that's not really doing what it's supposed to do. I would love to see more reporters following that and also talking about the solutions. Solutions journalism is hard for an industry that is in such a level of crisis. Like, what solution is an actual solution, or is it a solution to a piece of it? And I think if it's a solution to a piece of it, that's enough. We should be writing about that. We should be uplifting that and doing more of it. So I want to see childcare take that sort of next step to more in-depth reporting.
I have a dystopian scenario. A lot of people in childcare are starting to talk about AI, and I've gotten interested in elder care, and AI is much talked about in elder care for being a companion to elderly people, and I don't see it as a possible solution myself for either childcare or elder care, but I imagine there will be a lot of stories maybe 5 years from now about a program that's working and look how this robot is taking care of the babies. And it'll be our job to maybe debunk those PR pieces before they start spreading.
No robot nannies, man. I was gonna say, I just think it's gonna take more stories of things that I do or that other people who are more features based or whatever with some research do, where you're talking to the healthcare provider, with the childcare providers, or you're talking to the kids where there's more like sitting on the rug, like you said, Mark, and like being there, like day in the life stories, but what it takes to do this. One of the best stories I ever did when I was working at the Palm Beach Post, it's like 20 years ago. We did a story up for Labor Day where each of us spent an hour at one person's um, place of business. And I was with cafeteria ladies out in Belle Glade, which is a very not wealthy area in Florida. A lot of our football players come from there. A lot of our sugar comes from there. Not a lot of money goes to there. And so these people, because the community is there and that people bring their kids in because maybe that's the only meal they're going to get a day, and that's another piece of childcare. And to be there with Miss Ruthie or whoever who'd been there for 20 years, with her little hairnet, with her scoop, and saying these are human beings who are providing the care for your kids, and how do we help them, how do we support them other than some place to stash your kids? What do we do with it? And I think it's going to take a lot more stories about the humanity of both sides of it, for a lot more people to care. And I think we're seeing that. I hope we're seeing that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I really hope that, 5 to 10 years from now, we're not needing to convince people anymore of why childcare is important. And we're not, the general public knows, I hope by that point, if not already, starting to understand, like Leslie, you were saying, like how little money providers make for the work they do and what childcare actually entails. Because if any, I mean, we all have children, but it's also very different to spend, 6 hours with 12 2-year-olds and one other adult in the classroom. And yeah, anytime I spend time in a childcare room, I'm just like, how do I fully capture this? Like the exhaustion, right? Like I feel exhausted and I get to walk out to my car and leave after an hour and a half or 2 hours. Like this, it's just, I wish more people understood, and hopefully in the future they will. I also hope, I mean, I would love to see more constant reporting. So there's not just an influx of stories when there's a new report out, or, when we're approaching a funding cliff. Like I would hope there's like a steady stream from all news outlets, not just those of us who cover it regularly, but just, we're seeing kind of consistent reporting. And I also hope, with more understanding, hopefully there can be more reporting on groups of children and providers that don't really get as much attention, like, home-based providers and informal providers serve more children than center-based care, but I feel like a lot of the stories are focused on center-based care. Um, and children with disabilities and caregivers who are taking care of children with disabilities. I feel like all of those issues hopefully will be more common once we kind of get past this like general setting the stage for people to understand the issue.
The one thing I think that's a common Q&A, we've mentioned the providers, and I'd like to actually use the last handful of minutes we have to sort of talk about ways that childcare reporting can either uplift more providers or show their stories or show some of the things you're talking about, Jackie, which is that they're working these incredibly hard jobs, not always being identified as professionals, not always getting either the training or support they need to do the work they're doing. What, in your experience as a reporter, yes, very briefly, can we say can be done to sort of help bring these people's roles more into a spotlight?
I think it's going, which takes funding and resources, going to the programs and having the luxury of time to be there and really do this like rich narrative reporting, where you can really bring your readers into the programs with you. I tried to do this in one story, which I think you may have shared it, Shamanica Fleming, who's a provider here in Austin. And it's just like there are endless details that I could only hope to put in to get people to understand. But I think that's the reporting we all need to be able to do. I know that all of us here do that and try to do as much as we can. But again, it takes funding and you need enough staff members so that you can go do that, right? And you're not missing other stories that are happening.
Yeah, oh, sorry, go ahead, Mark.
Oh, I was just gonna stories about the providers, but also stories by the providers are amplifying their voices so that it's not third person, but first person.
Yes.
And that might take collaboration, and you just have to be respectful of their privacy, but making sure that their voice is the way they want it to come out.
Yeah.
I think that's, I'm okay, go ahead.
Go ahead, Lizzie. I'll
I was
go.
gonna say very quickly, when we first brought our son home, my late husband was like, can't we just find some like neighborhood lady to take him? Because like that's what childcare daycare was. Like there was some like my late husband was Jewish. He's like, there's a nice Jewish lady somewhere. It's Boca. They'll find. It's like there's not though. That's not what we do. And because you don't know that, because nobody talks about that. I think just you're right to amplify the voices of not just the individual providers, but also the hierarchy of how these things work and why there aren't like neighborhood ladies anymore, and why it's more efficient to have a center rather than like Miss Janie down the street who keeps a couple kids until their mothers get off work, because that's how I was raised. And I think it also speaks to our societal structure that we used to be more plugged into our community, so we knew who the neighborhood ladies were. We knew somebody's grandma. We knew the person who raised somebody else. And I think that those stories are interesting because we talk about why that is and why those structural changes have happened.
So I've thought about this a lot because I grew up with a childcare provider my entire life. I've been changing diapers since I was like 6 years old. And my grandmother took care of kids well into her 60s. And I mean, like we're talking like a bunch I mean, she was doing it by herself. It was crazy. And I think anybody that spends any amount of time with these folks immediately understands, wow, this is such an immense amount of work, and this is such an important piece of work that they're doing, what they're doing. Like I dropped off my kid this morning who was just having a raging day, and I was like, I'm gonna pray for y'all today because I don't know how you're gonna deal with him for the next, 12 hours. Not 12 hours, how many hours do I work? 8. And I think we just need to take people into that. We're still doing so much education on what childcare is, what it looks like, how difficult it is, and also who these people are as real people. So many of these providers do this out of immense love for these children and for this work, and then are getting, such paltry pay and benefits in return. And is that okay? And is that who you want to be taking care of your most precious gifts? So taking them inside, and we're still doing so much of that education. I think that's so important. But I want people to see them as the people that they are, and really oftentimes some of the most important people in our lives because they're, taking care of our kids.
It's a great point for us to end on, and I want to thank all of you guys for coming out today. And this is an amazing Q&A. We did not get to all of these questions, but it's been really inspiring to see the questions and the comments. I want to give a huge thank to the panelists, Mark, Leslie, Chivelli, and Jackie, for joining us and giving your time and coming with such great energy and enthusiasm to this conversation. I want to thank Tanya Casago and Carly Anderson from New America, who've been running the back end of this so flawlessly and seamlessly. Thank you. And I also want to thank Linda Shockley at Early Learning Nation for helping us see this vision through and for being an unwavering support of independent journalists everywhere. Like I said, please follow these journalists, please follow their work, please subscribe to your local paper, please keep childcare journalism going, both with your energy, enthusiasm, reading, sharing these stories. It really matters a lot to the journalists who write it, and it really matters a lot for us to have readers like you who care about these topics. So thank you all.